Okay, let's jump right into this story out of Maine. It's quite a confrontation, really, between the state and the Trump administration.
Absolutely. It centers on transgender student rights, specifically in sports, and federal funding for school meals, of all things.
Right. We've got Governor Janet Mills essentially drawing a line in the sand against an executive order from President Trump.
And it played out pretty much exactly as she predicted. It went to court.
And Maine came out on top in this particular round.
Yeah, it's a fascinating clash. You have a state with its own inclusive policies
hmm
running right up against a federal directive trying to impose, well, a much more restrictive view on transgender athletes.
So let's unpack how it started. February 5th, 2025. President Trump signs this executive order.
The No Men and Women's Sports Order.
Exactly. And the mandate was pretty clear. Institutions getting federal money had to ban transgender girls and women from female sports teams.
And the rationale given was this claim about protecting cisgender athletes, saying their victories were being stolen, though, evidence for that seems pretty thin based on what's out there.
It wasn't just high school sports either, was it? The potential reach seemed much broader.
Oh, definitely. It could have touched everything from like elementary schools all the way up to universities, maybe even organizations getting federal dollars like the U.S. Olympic Committee.
Wow. Okay.
The core idea was really that your sex assigned at birth dictates your sports category. Very binary.
And that flew directly in the face of Maine's existing policy. They allow transgender girls in girls' sports.
Correct, which set up this direct conflict.
Governor Mills was apparently very clear about her stance. There was a meeting at the White House in February.
Yeah, that's right. President Trump basically gave an ultimatum: comply with the order or lose federal funding.
And her response?
Pretty legendary, apparently. Just looked him in the eye and said, "We'll see you in court."
It's direct.
It certainly is. Really set the tone. It wasn't just talk. It was a clear signal Maine intended to fight this legally.
And the administration didn't wait around. The USDA, led by Secretary Brooke Rollins, moved to freeze funds.
Yep. Over $3 million, money specifically earmarked for Maine's school nutrition programs.
And the reason they gave was that Maine's sports policy violated Title IX.
That was the official justification. Title IX, of course, bans sex discrimination in federally funded education programs. The USDA's interpretation here was that allowing trans girls on girls' teams discriminated against cisgender girls.
Which is quite an interpretation of Title IX.
It's definitely a contested one. Now, the USDA tried to sort of soften it, claiming the freeze only hit administrative and tech costs, not the actual food money.
But the Maine Department of Education pushed back on that.
They did. They reported they couldn't access the funds needed for the administrative staff who actually run these programs. So, even if the food itself wasn't immediately cut off, crippling the administration, well, that causes problems fast.
And we're talking about programs feeding a lot of people.
Over 170,000 children and vulnerable adults in Maine rely on these programs. So the stakes were incredibly high.
What kind of admin rules would be hit? Are we talking about the people processing applications, managing distribution?
Exactly that. Everything from handling the paperwork, ensuring nutritional standards, logistics of getting food where it needs to go, disrupt that, and the whole system starts to wobble. It really raises questions about using essential services like food programs as, well, leverage in policy fights.
Especially when kids are involved.
Precisely.
So Maine didn't just roll over. Governor Mills and Attorney General Aaron Frey took legal action.
They moved quickly, filed a lawsuit in early April asking for a temporary restraining order to unfreeze that money immediately.
What was their main legal argument?
They hit it hard, called the USDA's decision arbitrary, capricious, not in accordance with law, basically arguing it was made without reason, without following rules.
Arbitrary and capricious. That sounds like legal speak for they just did it because they felt like it.
Pretty much. It means there wasn't a rational connection between the facts and the decision, or that they ignored proper procedure. They pointed out Secretary Rollins offered no real legal basis for saying Maine's policy actually violated Title IX.
And they highlighted the real-world impact too, right? Layoffs, food shortages.
Yes. They made it clear this wasn't just abstract. It could lead to state employees losing jobs and, crucially, real hunger for children and vulnerable adults if the funds weren't restored. That potential for immediate, tangible harm likely resonated with the court.
And it seems it did. A federal judge stepped in.
Granted Maine that temporary restraining order in April. It paused the freeze, told the USDA hands off the funds, at least until a hearing set for May 9th.
But it didn't even get to that hearing date.
Nope. Before that, the USDA essentially folded on this specific issue. They agreed to settle the lawsuit.
They backed down. Why do you think they did that?
Well, likely a combination of things. The legal ground might have seemed shaky. Maybe the negative optics of withholding food funds from kids wasn't playing well. Whatever the reason, they settled.
And the settlement basically says,
It requires the USDA and Secretary Rollins to stop freezing, terminating, or messing with Maine's access to these USDA funds based on these specific Title IX claims unless they follow all the proper legal steps. It puts the brakes on unilateral action like this.
Governor Mills definitely framed it as a win. She said, well, we did see him in court, and we won.
A clear message. She emphasized the funds were vital for those 172,000 kids and were frozen without due process, without real justification.
Attorney General Frey backed that up.
He did. Said the lawsuit was necessary to hold the USDA accountable, and the settlement confirms they can't just cut off funds like this without following the law.
So a victory for Maine on the school meals front. It upholds due process.
Definitely. It shows states can push back effectively against federal actions they see as overreach, especially when essential services are on the line.
But you mentioned this specific issue. This isn't the total end of the conflict, is it?
Unfortunately for Maine, no. There's still another separate legal action underway. This one's from the Department of Justice.
Following referrals from education and HHS, right?
Correct. And this lawsuit targets a much, much bigger pot of money.
How much are we talking?
Over $864 million in broader education funding, money that primarily supports students with disabilities and kids from low-income families.
Wow, that's huge.
Hey.
And the argument is still the same. Maine's inclusive sports policy violates Title IX.
That's the core allegation, yes. It seems the administration is still pursuing this line of argument just through a different department and aiming at a larger funding stream.
And U.S. Attorney General Pamela Bondi has suggested Maine isn't alone.
Right. She explicitly mentioned other states like California and Minnesota, states with similar inclusive policies, could be next. It suggests this is potentially a wider strategy, not just focused on Maine.
Which aligns with what civil rights groups are saying, that this is part of a bigger national push.
Exactly. They see it as a campaign to chip away at protections for transgender students, using federal funding as a tool to pressure states into adopting certain policies around gender.
It fits a pattern we're seeing nationally, doesn't it?
It does. The ACLU is tracking hundreds, literally hundreds of bills in state legislatures targeting LGBTQ plus rights, many focused on schools and sports. So Maine's fight is really a microcosm of a much larger national debate and, frankly, legal battle.
It's interesting, too, when you look at the actual numbers involved in sports.
You mean the NCAA testimony?
Yeah, NCAA President Charlie Baker saying there are fewer than 10 transgender athletes competing across all NCAA sports out of 500,000 athletes.
It's a stark statistic. Less than 10. It does make you question whether the scale of the proposed bans lines up with the actual situation on the ground or if it's driven more by, other factors.
Ideology, maybe.
Politics.
Could be. It certainly challenges the narrative that this is about widespread competitive imbalance threatening women's sports. The data just doesn't seem to support that premise on a large scale.
So, wrapping this part up, Governor Mills won the battle over the school meal funding. A significant victory.
Absolutely. Restored vital funds, upheld due process, showed legal challenges can work. But the war, so to speak, over the larger education funding and the core issue of transgender inclusion in schools, that continues.
Precisely. The DOJ lawsuit with that massive $864 million figure looming shows the pressure is still very much on Maine. And potentially other states. This conflict is far from over.
So Maine's success against the USDA restored critical school meal funding for, 172,000 kids and vulnerable adults. That's huge. And it really underscores why due process matters, why legal challenges against perceived federal overreach are important.
Definitely. But as we've discussed, that massive DOJ lawsuit is still out there, threatening enormous education funding cuts. It signals this fight over transgender rights, particularly in schools, is nowhere near finished.
And that really tees up a fundamental question, doesn't it? A question for you listening.
Yeah.
How should states navigate this? How do you balance ensuring the rights and the inclusivity of all students when faced with federal policies, directives, and potentially huge funding cuts?
It's a tough balancing act. You really have to consider the potential long-term impacts of these legal fights, not just on the transgender youth directly affected, but on the entire public education system nationwide. What does this mean for the future?